his cohort, Parrish Berquist, who is an assistant professor at Georgetown now, teaching courses in environmental policy and statistics, but was working with YPCCC back when we did the work that we're going to be telling you about. So thanks to the support of many of you, Interfaith Power and Light was able to really do our biggest voter outreach campaign ever in 2020. And here's just a couple of the news clips on the screen there. I know you've heard a bit probably about our voter campaign in 2020, and we're going to give you a little bit of an overview, but spend most of our time today sharing with you the results of an experiment we did that we think are quite encouraging. So, Faith, Climate Justice Voter Campaign. We included a voter pledge, climate and voter sermons, a multi-issue faith voter reflection guide, and back in early 2020, we were even planning hosting parties at the polls at congregations that serve as voting sites. Obviously, that was not to be. We did have a number of active partners on this campaign. And as I mentioned, the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication was really involved in helping us design this campaign from the very beginning. Thank you again, Joshua. And Environmental Voter Project, who some of you know, was a really important early advisor on the voter pledge that we started to do, the Faith Voter Pledge. We also had active partners in the faith community, many of whom you can see here, worked especially closely with Green the Church that reaches Black churches primarily, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, which reaches young evangelicals, and Catholic Climate Covenant that reaches Catholics. So those were some important constituencies we wanted to be sure to reach. So those were real active partners along with other faith groups that got involved later on. And then, of course, March 2020. And this is what our congregations looked like. Not a great place for collecting pledges or doing a lot of one-on-one in-person outreach. So we shifted to virtual. We did a virtual climate in the pulpits, doing sermons online, sharing sermon resources with our congregations. Of course, many congregations shifted to Zoom and YouTube and had great participation in services. So we feel like we were able to still reach a lot of people through congregation services. And we also did webinars on the voter guide that went through multiple issues that we thought people of faith would want to take into account when voting. And we had real active participation, especially in North Carolina and Virginia, from people in congregations wanting to hear what the key issues were from a faith perspective. We also became active on social media, more active, and we asked clergy to give a little message online to videotape themselves and share a message about voting. And here's a good one I'll share with you. It's really short from our friend Margaret Bullitt Jonas.
My name is Margaret Bullitt Jonas. I'm an Episcopal priest. I serve as Missioner for Creation Care for the Episcopal Diocese of Western Massachusetts and for the United Church of Christ in Southern New England. My son makes me laugh sometimes. He says there are tomorrow problems and there are today problems. More and more of us are realizing that climate change is not a tomorrow problem, it's a today problem. It needs to be addressed now. Already we are seeing its effects worldwide and right here at home in the United States. We need faithful moral leadership in this country more than ever. So I invite you to join me and to become a faith climate justice voter. use your pain, use your anger, use your love, use your power, and join me in voting for candidates that will protect the web of life that God entrusted to our care. Thank you.
So that was a nice little pitch for the pledge. Uh-oh.
My name is Margaret Bullitt Jonas.
Sorry.
I'm an Episcopal priest.
Okay, we don't need to hear that again. Then we also decided to reach out to voters by text. And you're going to hear more about that in this presentation. But one of the things we shared by text was the electronic version of our voter guide. And I mentioned the multi-issue voter guide earlier. And the reason it was multiple issues is because we wanted to make sure we were doing a 501c3 compliant campaign. And we weren't only talking about climate change, because unfortunately that's been kind of pegged as a partisan issue, kind of along the lines of abortion. So we have multiple issues. We put this guide together with faith in public life, and it talked about democracy, immigration, criminal justice, and peace, as well as environment and climate change. Overall results, we texted voters in these 6 states, and we were able to get over 1,000 pledges for people to vote with climate in mind just via text. So this is texting voters who were outside of our network. So we figured Interfaith Power and Light supporters were probably already pretty likely to vote, and we wanted to use our faith voice and our volunteers to reach out to other faith voters who might be less likely to vote. So that was our target audience. And we also got hundreds of views of the voter guide online. We got people who pledged to recruit 3 friends to vote. And 167 people were helped via text to request their absentee ballots. And overall, together with our partners, the texting campaign, we were able to reach over 1 million voters. Now, Joshua, would you like to take it from here?
Yeah. So as part of the broader campaign, which again involved multiple aspects like the social media campaign and the voter guide and a number of other aspects, we included an experiment in this to measure the impact of whether texting voters and IPL texting voters in this election whether that turned out more people to vote. So let me just start by talking about why we were texting. So many of the campaign elements that we have talked about were based on best practices and evidence-based practices to turn out voters. Text messaging has been shown to be a particularly effective campaign. But before I continue to talk about text messaging, let me just tell you what exactly we're talking about. So we're talking about peer-to-peer texting, and you've probably, if you're like me, have received a text message at some point from a campaign, but you might not know how the back end of this works. So I should take a second to just tell you about that. There are computer programs, Hustle and ThroughText are 2 of the bigger ones, that allow volunteers to quickly send hundreds of text messages to voters or supporters. And it's like every click of the mouse is another text message. And when people respond to that, it shows up on the volunteer's computer screen, and the voter and the volunteer can have a conversation about voting. This has been a proven practice over the years. It has the advantage of it's COVID safe. These were virtual text banks, so everybody was super safe. It's also pretty inexpensive and cost effective. IPL was texting people who were likely to be people of faith, likely to be alarmed about climate change, and were infrequent voters. And so you may know, when I say infrequent voters, we know they were infrequent voters because whether you vote is public and who you vote for is private. So that is key to know as you think about this, this experiment. Well, who are the alarmed? So you know who people of faith are, but the alarmed, this is part of Yale's 6 America segmentation. It is the people who are convinced global warming is happening, human caused, an urgent threat, and strongly support climate policies. Most, however, do not know what they and others can do to solve the problem, whether that's voting, talking to an elected official, or driving a hybrid car. They just don't know. And many of them have never been asked to take action. Demographically, the alarmed are diverse. We find that Latinos and African Americans are more likely to be alarmed or concerned about global warming than whites. And in contrast, whites are more likely to be doubtful and dismissive than Latinos and African Americans. So this is a key population for the Faith Climate Justice voter campaign. And while many alarmed Americans vote, millions of alarmed Americans are unlikely to vote unless somebody asks them to. And this experiment was limited to 4 states, not all of the ones previously on the listed, and state affiliates of IPL opted in to be part of this experiment. And I think they got a huge value for doing that. So next slide. And so the states that were included in this experiment were North Carolina, Minnesota, Michigan, and New Hampshire. And we incorporated several best practices into the script. Because there was a multitude of funding sources, we had a few different tactics that we needed to incorporate into the script that we were able to do. And so the one example text message conversation is basically like this. Hi, I'm Joshua. I'm a volunteer with Interfaith Power and Light. We're making sure everyone in our community votes on November 3rd. As a person of faith, I believe this election is about values shaping our future. Do you know if your voter registration is current? And if the person said no, they were directed to a website to update their voter registration. If it was yes, then they got a copy of the voter guide, which is another proven best practice. And before I turn over this to Parrish to go through the methodology, I should highlight that the benchmark for peer-to-peer texting is a lift or an increase of 0.5 percentage points. So what that means is that if 50% of voters in a community are likely to vote, if you text them, that will increase to 50.5%. And while that might not sound like a ton, we know 2020 showed us just how important every vote is. And with that, I'll turn it over to Parrish to go over the methodology.
Thanks, Josh. Susan, you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what we did was to set this up and gauge the impact of the campaign so we pulled a sample of 235,847 voters from these 4 states all together that fell into those categories that Josh described. So people who are people of faith and alarmed and relatively unlikely to vote. And then we randomly divided that list. Within each state, we assigned half of the list to what we were going to call a control group and half of the list to what we're going to call a treatment group. And the control group was assigned to not receive any communication from IPL, and the treatment group was assigned to be a part of this text message campaign. Then, because this was a volunteer-run campaign and we weren't sure if the volunteers in each of the 4 states would be able to get to every single voter, we randomized the order of that treatment list. And what that means is if the volunteers didn't get to everybody, we could assume that the people they didn't get to were randomly selected rather than, for example, being people who were just at the end of the alphabet. And what that does for us, all of this randomization of people ensures that people who receive the text message campaign are not any different from the people who don't receive it. And they're also not any different in ways that would predict whether or not they vote. So that's what allows us to isolate the effect of the campaign itself from any other factors that drive people to vote. This, by the way, is my cat, Gordy. She might flitter across the screen in a moment. And what we ended up with after the campaign was over, after the IPL volunteers got to all of the people in those treatment lists that they were going to be able to get to, was a final treatment group, a final group of people who were in the campaign of 87,954. And then the control group of people who were not texted by IPL was 147,893 people. You can go to the next slide, Susan. So then we used OLS regression modeling to analyze the difference in voter turnout between these two groups and assign that, and we can conclude, because of the randomization that we used, that difference is attributable to the text campaign itself. So what we found was that 35.1% of the control group voted, and by comparison, 36.8% of the treatment group voted. And so that's a 1.7 percentage point increase in voter turnout due to the text campaign that IPL ran. And so what this means is that almost 1,500 additional people voted because of the campaign in these 4 states. So that's really exciting. That's a really exciting effect. And I'm going to turn it back over to Susan to wrap us up.
All right, thank you, Parrish. So I just wanted to briefly touch on our next steps. We were encouraged to see these results because even though it may be at first glance, oh, it doesn't sound like so much, 1.7%. Many campaigns would love to be able to see that kind of effect. Just to be able to move people in voting is really, really challenging. And we know, as Joshua said, how close elections are these days. So turning people out to vote is, can really change the results. So we want to apply this learning to our work in 2022. We want to have another national campaign with a focus on maybe 2 to 3 states this time. We think this will look like similar to the campaign in 2020, but we will probably start earlier with the voter registration focus in 2022. And we also want to look into funding our affiliates, maybe the 2 or 3 states that will be able to fund even more significantly so that they can hire a full-time organizer and hopefully get that person in place and hired by the end of this year. We know that campaigns will start looking for talent soon, and we want to make sure we can get good people hired to work on our campaign in our target states for 2022. We'll also support our congregations to lead a multi-faith coordinated effort in their faith communities. And we're going to look into possibly doing some direct mail, so supplementing texting outreach with direct mail. So that's the overview of our campaign and the results of our experiment. Here's a bunch of our state leaders, campaign members saying thank you for your support, and we can open it up for questions now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Marv, jump right in.
Will there be a need to have a control group going forward? Does one campaign prove the point so that we could try to get everyone rather than just the non-control group?
Well, my understanding was that some of our folks really wanted to text the control group. But for the experiment, we couldn't do it that way. Joshua, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So the good news is that millions of Americans are alarmed, and that millions of Americans would be willing to vote if somebody asked them to. So that, and millions of Americans are also people of the faith. We know that the vast majority of Americans are people of faith. And so that means that there are so many people that are out there that randomizing the work into a treatment and control group doesn't mean that IPL can't contact more people. It just means that because IPL has been thoughtful and planful about its campaign, that it's able to measure the impact of its campaign in this aspect. IPL's impact for this campaign was actually much greater than just this test. But for this aspect, we're able to measure it. And so we're able to give you, okay, this is working and this is not working. But that is at a given period of time with a given population also. So just because something worked once doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to keep working every time. And so it's important for people to keep measuring, keeping evidence-based, keep experimenting so that we can be ensuring that we're having the impact. And at the end of the day, if you're planful, if you're thoughtful about how you set up your campaign, it doesn't mean you have any less impact. It actually means that you have more as you go forward.
Can I just add something here too? I would definitely echo everything that Josh and Susan have said there. And then one other thing is, so you remember I said that we randomized the order of the treatment group lists. And then we had our final group of treated respondents was smaller than the group of respondents that were initially assigned to treatment. So what that meant was we actually didn't get to everybody in the treatment group, let alone the control group. So this campaign actually in some ways really stretched IPL's volunteer capacity, and randomizing was a really awesome way to take advantage of the fact that IPL has this resource scarcity, which is volunteers. You're relying on people who are needing to be texting people, and you don't have the capacity to text everybody. So in that world, it's a really great thing to be able to randomize who you don't get to, and then you can measure the impact of the campaign. And then another thing I would say is that, can y'all still see me? My screen just went dark. Yeah, okay. Another thing I would say is that sorry, everything just kind of, my computer's acting up today.
We can still see you and hear you.
Okay, I'm kind of looking up because you're now on my, my external monitor, which is not right in front of me. So I'm going to try and look right in front of me. There might be other things that you would want to experiment with. So what we learned, as Josh said, in this campaign is that this worked in these 4 states with this particular audience that was targeted and these particular types of texts. But there might be an opportunity to understand different messages or different types of targeting or a whole different strategy. So that's
Thanks.
So I have 2 questions for Joshua and Parrish. The first one is, I think one of the lessons from Georgia was how important it is to have trusted messengers. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, just how effective we can be through text or some other things, rather than building a network that allows us to connect with people who in turn can connect with their communities. Mm-hmm. And my second question has to do with, I'm really pleased to see that the 6 America study is now dividing the alarm group into active, willing, and inactive. But I'm very concerned, and this is an argument that's happening among many activists right now, is how many of the willing are actually virtue signaling and pretend that they don't know what to do, as opposed to actually being willing to do the work, because this is really difficult work. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Okay.
I can speak to your, oh, sorry.
Yeah. Paris,
Okay,
why don't
I'll
you-
speak to your second question really quick, because I agree with you. This is a fact about the Six Americas study and that segmentation analysis is that it's based on surveys. And so the data that we have is the data, the things that people tell us about how they think about climate change. And we don't see any actual behavior in that survey. And a real opportunity that organizations like IPL and other groups who are engaging with people out in the world is to actually, there are ways to track real behaviors out in the world through organizations that are trying to recruit people into volunteer capacities and things like that. And so to understand what people are actually doing, we actually need a different type of research, which is engaging with people sort of out in the real world. And I think that's some of the research that I'm sort of most excited about moving forward.
Yeah. And I approach things not necessarily just as a researcher, but more as an organizer. So I come from the campaigning world, the organizing world. And so I very much appreciate your thought about having trusted messengers. So one of the things that unfortunately this test didn't allow us to see, but we could think about testing for 2022 is whether IPL and its members and supporters and leaders, by their position in the community, are trusted messengers with more people than they even know. And that's something we could test. We could have one message come from a faith leader, and we could have one message come from a secular leader, and see if there is a difference between those in terms of different behaviors. And so I would love to test that. But that's something we have to think through whether IPL has the capacity and the right partners to do that, and whether it's strategic for IPL's goals. And the second piece is when I look at that segmentation analysis, I approach it as an organizer, and I look at the resources that I have, the resources that I can organize, and then I look at the opportunity there. And when the research that I've seen, there's probably around 10 million to 12 million Americans that are members of environmental organizations. And there are about 70 million alarmed. And while many people might be virtue signaling, maybe they are, the best way to find out if they are is to give them an opportunity to take action, to get involved in their community in a variety of different ways, ideally with a trusted messenger. But if there's not a trusted messenger available, whatever messenger is available, and give people opportunities to take action, to get involved in their community, to do everything from vote to be an activist with IPL, to organize a campaign in their community. But 70 million Americans is a lot of people, and we're only scratching the surface there. So, so even if it's only a third, or even if it's only a tenth of that are actually willing to do the hard work, that would be the difference between who's active and who is willing to be active actually. that is a huge movement that we could organize if we had the resources as the climate movement, and that's why I get up every day, actually. So.
Well, and I just want to say that I hope Susan Stevenson's ears were burning earlier today, because I was talking with Kim Noble of Green the Church about the good advice that Susan had given Kim about our upcoming summit. And this is such a heavy lift that if we don't find a way to partner with Blessed Tomorrow and many of the other organizations that are in the same space, it just becomes that much more difficult. It's obvious. I mean, to me, it's just impossible that IPL by itself is going to be able to do this. We really have to look at some sort of partnership and how we create that partnership, and who has deep pockets and who has deep resources in terms of volunteers. So thank you. That helps.
And Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, but as I recall, originally we were also planning to run some experiments around sermons that we had to shift out of that. Is that correct, Joshua? We had to shift from that because of not having in-person worship. It had to do with collecting the pledges. Is that right? We were trying to see if the sermons would have an impact on people who pledged. But
Yeah.
Right.
So we did look at that, and I think Parrish has an experiment design that's nearly ready to go if the world shifts in a really positive way and we start to have in-person faith gatherings. So that is definitely on the shelf, ready to be pulled when y'all are ready. I will say that was a fairly high capacity experiment. And I think there are versions of that where we can get some really useful information in the lab that may not be as resource intensive, because the design that Parrish has requires a lot of outreach, a lot of organizing, a lot of trust building, and is something that, you know, I would think that you would need us, you know, several $100,000s to think about in terms of organizing that particular part of the experiment, unless you had a much bigger volunteer base.
great, thank you. Other questions?
One other comment on what you were talking about, Joshua, with 70 million Americans who are climate alarmed. I mean, one exciting thing about, you know, I think the faith community, and not just IPL, but working with the church and other faith partners, is these are ways that we can reach those people. So many of those people, most of those 70 million, are not members of environmental organizations. Many more of them are connected with the faith community. So we have a great forum, you know, way to reach people, and to reach people in a place, you know, of values, you know. So we know that people are more motivated to change and to take action when you reach them, when your message includes values that they resonate with, as opposed to just a political message or an economic message. So it is a huge audience, potential audience that we have to reach. But the really good news is that we have ways to reach them, and we've proven that it can be effective. That simple outreach, you know, as impersonal as it may feel, to text someone, this is how people communicate these days. And so I think it's encouraging. And we have, you know, it's great that we can take this learning into 2022 and hopefully expand upon that.
Joshua or Parrish, could you put the 1.7% increase in voting into some kind of perspective?
Yeah.
Because on its face, it doesn't sound like like it's a lot. Although I happen to know that it actually is a lot.
Yeah. It's actually so very much. It's so much that I asked Parrish to run the numbers several times. And so the benchmark that if you were to talk to political scientists and campaigners around Washington, D.C., and you ask them how much, if I run a texting campaign, how many more people will I turn out? And they'll say about 0.5 percentage points. So 1.7% is 3 times that increase, which is huge. It's enough that I asked Parrish to rerun the numbers several times, and Parrish will tell you that we did that, and we did it until we were very confident in that number. And so that is the context. It's 3 times more than the benchmark. And as you scale up and are able to reach more people, you could just imagine what that could be if you were able to reach more people.
It's also, if you think about it in the context of an election, that we don't know who those people voted for. We just know that they voted. But that is a number of people that's a number of people that can swing a state. Close elections are won by less than 2%. So, it's big in the context of prior research, and it's also large substantively.
Yeah, I would also want to point out that we don't know who else was reaching out to these people. So there could be a lot of noise that is going on in these voters' lives, from their kids talking about where we're going to eat dinner to other campaigns talking about voting or not voting. And IPL was able to break through and increase the likelihood people would vote. And that's pretty amazing.
And ultimately, that's what we want, right? We want more voter participation.
Mm-hmm.
So what were you, Haiti, were you asking something? Did I see you put a finger up?
I think David put a finger up. And I think we're just wondering why those people aren't voting.
Well, okay, so yeah, we targeted the people who were not regular voters. Why they're not regular voters, I don't know if we know that.
Well, it seems to me that if you're going to be approaching, I have a lot of questions about this, but if you're going to be approaching people to encourage them to vote, and they're not regular voters, you darn well ought to know in 2 questions, what's the key reason or the couple of reasons that it gets in the way of them voting. If they're really they're concerned, according to you, and yet they're not voting. Because if you don't have a solution for that, it's not going to move them. And it might be something you'd want to discuss, because that may be one of the things you'd want to say is, well, if you can vote, and it'd be wonderful if you will, what stands in the way, what would have to change? Can we help? And that's one of the issues I was wondering about. I was also curious, realistically, how many people can someone text and support the responses? Because clearly that ratio of active person to respondents limits your ability to scale unless you've got a whole bunch of motivated people.
So Parrish, do you have thoughts about why people don't vote. I certainly have a few, but you're the political scientist.
Yeah, I mean, I think it wasn't part of this experiment to ask people why they don't vote. I think that's a great point that we need to be engaging more around why people aren't voting. But from the political science research, there's a bunch of reasons. Structural reasons that people they don't have time off. They don't know, there isn't good information about where they're supposed to vote. There isn't, they don't have childcare and they have to take care of kids. There's just a lot in this country, particularly with low-income people, there are just a lot of sort of life logistics and work logistics that get in the way of people voting. And then there's also the matter of indifference and people not, losing trust in the political system. There are just disaffected voters who, and people don't vote for those reasons. I suspect that the people that we were able to turn out in this experiment were more of the former group, people who maybe didn't know where, they just didn't have a plan to vote and they needed help coming up with a plan. That I think can make a really big difference.
Yeah, and with this election in particular, it was confusing for even the most informed people about where to vote and what was changing. And so the intervention of having some information about there's an election coming up, COVID hasn't canceled the election, there's still an election coming up, and this is how you can vote, is a key informational intervention that can help make sure people vote. And sometimes people just need to have a conversation and know that it's going to make an impact. And that's really hard to sometimes think about, not having an impact in today's world. But that's sometimes one of the things. And so having a commitment to someone, even someone as over the internet and over the text message, can make a real difference whether or not someone votes.
So is there some way that you can give to encourage that sense of having an impact? Is there some way that you can give metrics back to the people that you've contacted in terms of the shift from what their pattern of their area was before to what it is later? And if I were in a given location and there were 200 other people in some voting area where you know what the results are from that particular precinct or something, and you can say, well, there's 35 of you that we're contacting, or there's 200 that we know are interested, they're motivated, but you haven't voted. Here's what we would expect the number, if there's no change, and here's the change you can make. And find some way to give them a little feedback and make it some kind of a collective. I don't know if people are motivated that way, but is there any kind of team sense of, hey, I'll get a hold of my neighbors, we're gonna see if we can outdo the other 35 precincts around here?
Yeah. There is lots of research when it comes to voting about creating a sense of community and letting people know that the community is voting and that their neighbors are going to vote, and then it's public whether or not you vote. The type of follow-up that you're talking about is something that is pretty resource intensive, frankly, to do and to keep track of. And so I think if money was no object, and IPL had 1,000 organizers or 10,000 organizers, I would be really excited to do that. Susan, you may need to go on a hiring spree. But I think I think it would be effective. I think it's a matter of the resources to accomplish that, because it's really keeping track of people like that is really hard.
It's interesting though. It would be interesting. And I know the pledge, you know, this is one reason we started out doing the pledge, because the Environmental Voter Project had found, you know, from their data that almost half of self-described environmentalists were not voting. But when they pledged, when someone asked them to pledge to vote, they made that intention to vote. They made a commitment to vote. They were then more likely to vote. So that's kind of partly what we based our campaign on.
Yeah, and I was just going to quickly add, those were great questions and ideas. From my experience of being a volunteer with the text banking, the program is really easy to use and everything is kind of preloaded for us. So I think like in one night I texted 500 people, for example. I think the key to remember is that a lot of them don't respond at all. So, you know, for all 500 that you do, I maybe interacted with 20, you know, or 25 or whatever, who responded in some way. And some of them reply stop because they don't want to get any more texts. So they're opting out. But others, you know, there's some conversation with, and it's really interesting, you know, because, you know, we'd have people who say, speaking to what Parrish was suggesting about some of the barriers is, you know, I don't know if I'm registered to vote, or I don't know where my polling precinct is. And we were able then to direct them to those resources with a link that they could go to find that. And that was part of really helping people create a plan to vote. Which I think gets back to what Parrish and Josh were both saying is, you know, really giving people the resources and the tools that they need, because for some folks, they just don't know how to do that, or what the process is, or whether they're registered. And the more we could help them with the tools and the resources, I think the more likely they were probably to vote.
And I'm cognizant of the time here. I don't want to keep you all over time, but these are some really good thought-provoking questions. I guess we should wrap it up unless